Lazarus, the day has finally dawned. The Fractality of Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll Part 2, and this is 10 years later. Many of you regard that film as the favorite conversation that you've seen of my wheezing. And of course, it was with my beloved friend Dan Winter a decade ago when he and I were 10 years older, actually. He said churlishly, look, we've got a little clip here. It's just over 2 minutes long. And I want to kick off with this. Producer Christy queued it up. I haven't seen it myself for 10 years. So here goes.
Hi. The last time I saw you, you were about 40 foot high on a screen behind me on stage at the Global Breakthrough Energy Conference. You've shrunk down. Are you involved in some weird experimentation?
We've got over a dozen exciting projects underway. Just released this new paper, Origin of Negentropic Field. We claim to understand the frequency signature of the biological principle of origin of all negentropy in biology, actually. Bliss is actually a biologic necessity, and it's worth pursuing.
So what is the bliss hertz?
Well, we showed that the EEG brainwave power spectrum at the moment of bliss peak experience is not in the golden ratio, the onset of that frequency series in the brainwaves, which we can measure and actually measure bliss process. What I learned from Bill is not only that, but that the right and left hemisphere need to be 180 degrees out of phase when that's happening. So your brain produces a longitudinal compression wave at the center, like the slinkies and crescent. That's called flame in the mind. And that's part of how focused human attention causes electric fields to compress. And that's what initiates the centripetal force, which is the very definition of mindfulness.
Claiming our sovereignty and engaging with consciousness, so to speak, seems to be that is really an emergent pattern of perfection, where people are recognizing they can step out of the invisible contract.
And again, the biologic language there would be that politic was defined as body polis, which is the ability to have a collective, movable plasma like a beehive which doesn't swarm until the queen has bliss.
Dad, love you madly and delighted with this conversation. Thank you so much.
Let's get together and play anytime. Perfect. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I think that was terribly cute. Today, the conversation with Dan is a planned exploration into the realms of spirituality, consciousness, and fractal science. And our guide for this adventure, of course, is the maestro himself, Dan Winter, a renowned polymath, most beloved by the Lazarus Initiative, easily accessed, incidentally, via physicsofsoul.com and at Dan Winter Fractal Field on YouTube. And with his extensive background in electrical engineering, psychophysiology, and sacred geometry, amongst other disciplines, Dan brings a unique perspective that transcends all conventional boundaries and opens up new dimensions of comprehension and understanding. Now, a decade ago, as I said, Dan and I delved into the intriguing intersections of the fractality of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And today, essentially, we're going to continue that journey with fresh insights and groundbreaking revelations. The obvious question to me is going to be, what's changed in 10 years? Dan, very happy to have you back.
Hey, Sacha, I think you look younger even in that film than me. So talk about sexy. You look like a rock star there. You look no, that was great. You know, the sex, drugs, rocks, and roll, it was originally a British joke, in that I'm admiring your British accent, actually South African. But the British joke was, you know, the kids need sex, drugs, and rock and roll because they're on the wrong turn on the right road, recognizing they need access to bliss process, which is how you get an immune system. And by the way, how you get immortal and take memory through death. And so, yes, we've learned a lot more about the biology of bliss, but the core point remains exactly the same, that literally Aboriginals were right. You do not have culture if you cannot teach your young people how to have a bliss experience. And we know the biomechanics.
Beautiful. So, Dan, in the last 10 years, what has been your essential focus?
Yeah, well, we have taken that insight that we described pretty well in that recording, that you take that harmonic series, which, by the way, is exactly a caduceus defined by the Schumann harmonics, which are defined by golden ratio multiples of Planck, called PlanckFire.com. It's a pure phase conjugate pump wave causing charge collapse, which is the only cause of life force, consciousness, and gravity. So what Einstein, it's a very simple, let's start very simply. What Einstein knew was that charge had to collapse infinitely for gravity to exist. What he didn't know was at the bottom of the vortex, and I wrote the equation for hydrogen to prove how the vortex works, golden ratio multiple of Planck. At the bottom of that vortex, when the charge implodes exactly to the Planck threshold, which is why Planck is the same for a million light years in all directions, the transverse electromagnetic inertia is converted only there into projection into coherent longitudinal EMF, sometimes called scalar. And that array is the gravity grid, but it's also the collective unconscious. So when you tune the harmonics of brainwaves, Schumann harmonics, hydrogen harmonics, and every new device that we have invented, Therify.net, piezofire.com, plasmafire, every single device is simply that exact frequency cascade, Schumann harmonics being one example. And what that does is implode the cascade, opening the drain hole through Planck for distribution into the longitudinal array. And that creates the centripetal force through center, defining the charge collapse, which causes consciousness, gravity, life force, and bliss. So we've now applied that to about 20 different technologies, and they're going viral, man. Check out our new piezofire.com. So yeah, we're having a lot of fun.
What are the applications there? Just touch on the applications, the actual tangible applications.
Well, one of the original tangible applications, when I took that equation for that spiral on the golden spiral on the 60-degree cone, it's this 60-degree cone into the nest of Plentodeca. It's a 60-degrie cone, implosive nest.
Yeah.
When I took that spiral from my equation for hydrogen and made a water vortex, the imploder.com, and when that water is piezo, it gains energy during charge collapse, defining gravity, consciousness, life force, and all-nig entropy. And that imploder has gone viral. And by the way, I have new partners. It's that project. So that was one example. And flameinmind.com, brainwaves for bliss, is another. Therify.net is another one. It's been out for years. New ones, piezofire.com, plasmafire.com, and coming soon, firecrystal.com. And they're all based on only, yeah. We're having a lot of fun.
What's a fire crystal, Dan? Simplest terms.
Well, you know, when Scotty said we had to switch off the we had to switch off the input power. And
because she was breaking up. She was breaking up.
Them dilithium crystals. Actually, it's lithium niobate, which is a piezo quartz-like. And the phase conjugate pump wave at the base, when they did it with called the Koski frost, they made 800 times the weight of the crystal in gravity. This is documented in the literature. So what you do is you take our piezofire.com, which piezoelectrically couples and implodes, and you can eliminate hernia pain in minutes. It's amazing, implosion. Well, you stick one of them at the bottom of a firecrystal.com.
Yeah.
And the longitudinal coherent beam that comes out the other end, you point that at the water, and I tell you, you know, all kinds of healing, all kinds of life force. It's amazing. So it's all about projecting a coherent longitudinal beam. That's the answer to all of these issues. How the pyramidwirelesspower.com works, how the fire crystal works, how the mercury vortex made gravity, how your heart makes gravity. It's about imploding to spit out a longitudinal beam. That's what it is. And Bearden properly defined coherent longitudinal beam as the definition of gravity waves.
So, Danny, and how do we view that in correlation to the empathic waveform of the actualized human heart?
Lovely question. In fact, it's the right question, Sacha. Yeah. In other words, how does that describe the physics of empathy? And we just did this new show on my memories of my Montauk friends, and I knew Michael Ash, who was a pen name, the chief time empath at Montauk. I knew him fairly well. And why did they call him a time empath? Okay, for the same reason that if you watch a shaman steering a tornado and observe the bioplasmic streamers embed from his belly into that tornado until he becomes the center of gravity of that tornado. And the shaman says, I'm eating the hoocha. What he means is I'm feeling the pain of. And as in the same way that Nostradamus sucked the future into himself by weeping for those whom he saw. So it is absolutely empathy, which is the physics here, which is the implosive force to feel something outside as if it were inside, which generates the centripetal force, which steers all tornadoes and ultimately defines pure intention and how you get through death. So it is that same exact process. We now know, as our friend Ray Moody nicely proved, that the death visions are electrically contagious, that actually the death process is precisely the same compression physics. So, which is why, that you see your life in a second before you die. It's a compression thing. So the key, I think the key clue there was when we were teaching kids to see without their eyes, they would close their eyes and make golden ratio alpha to gamma brain waves, and then they could see without their eyes. But suddenly, most of those kids said they're now seeing their grandmothers, their dead ancestors. And the physics of clairvoyance is exactly the same. They were embedding into the longitudinal array, the dreaming track, the definition of ancestor memory. So that same longitudinal array made by gravity waves is the sacred sites which define access to ancestor memory and telepathy. It's all about embedding into the longitudinal array.
So just to push that a bit further on the subject of empathy and the empathic wave, that, as you mentioned, the shaman or the empath, the healer in that sense, feels the pain in a sense of the other and eats the pain, so to speak. Is that eating of the pain of the other, or that extension of empathy, a necessary function of absolution? Is that what absolution is? That it takes a higher frequency of consciousness to willfully, consciously receive the pain of the lower consciousness element and to willfully absolve it through that sufferance? Is that a necessary function?
I love that question, and I think it's the right question. I would add us a little bit more electrical specificity there. Remember, pain is only a name for charge that bleeds because fractality is broken. So when you restore compression, pain disappears every time. That's the centerpiece of piezofire.com. So when you say you're absolving the pain, what you actually mean is you're adding the amount of centripetal force necessary to restore implosion. That's what you're saying. And so what that means, for example, when you have ghosts stuck in a room, if somebody has a large aura, they can use that implosion to then redistribute into that array and the ghost is released. Therify.net is also helpful in that regard. So do you have to feel empathy for that ghost? Well, what that ghost needs is the centripetal force of gaining energy during charge collapse. And someone with a big heart is perfect for that. But actually, the absolution, what we call forgiveness, is just the ability to recompress into that array. Remember, at the moment of death, the array cannot inhabit a wave which is not shareable. That means any form of anger, for example, absolutely will never survive death because it is not a distributable wave by definition. Actually, the Centix literature shows the anger wave is 1/7. It's absolutely destructive interference and cannot go through compression, will not make it through death for sure. There will be no implosion. And how do you forgive that anger? Well, you have to find the piece of that memory which actually creates a survival pure principle, or it's not forgiven.
So okay, you're leading me down that path. King Henry VIII hacked off the head of a number of his wives and was a an incredibly monstrous creature in his tenure as king when he was the crown of England, and he was really embodying the kind of crossfire psychoculturally and civilizationally, the crossfire of the Catholic Church and the purity. All of that stuff was going on, and in a sense he embodied it. Now his ghost is known to be thumping around various castles and domains in England. So when you talk about anger, fear, these elements that clearly entrapped that man in the course of his life just to speak further on the mechanics of ghosts, so people understand, of fear and love, why do these historical characters still loiter in the enclaves of those castles and those stately homes? What's really going on there?
The physics of ghosts is usefully instructive. A ghost presence is often measured by a reduction in temperature, quite simple. And that's because the imploding plasma requires to gather the heat. The other thing is a ghost can never, ever, just like a plasma ball, like an orb, can never inhabit a steel or aluminum box. Never, because the plasma, the charge is not distributable. So there are some definite no-go places for ghosts, the same place you do not want to go when you're outside your body, ever, because isolated charge is the opposite of life. But the real principle here is visualize that array called ancestor memory, communion of saints, Akashic records. That array is essentially a committee of 1 billion ancestors who are saying, this array is a library of survival memory by symmetry. And unless you serve that, whom does the Grail serve? Itself. Unless you serve that array by adding useful survival memory, pure principle, you cannot compress into that array. Literally, you have to be purely solvable, which is literally a purely shareable wave, which is literally the electrical definition of pure intention, which is measurable as coherence in the EKG. So the physics of ghosts is very useful here. Fragments of memory that have not served.
Yeah, that have not served.
That have not gained the centripetal force to implode into the array distributably, and therefore are stuck, are isolated in their charge distribution.
And so that speaks to negative actions, essentially, in the course of one's incarnation.
In other words, if you went to bed every night and played your day as if it was a movie backwards and did not need to interrupt, it would mean you'd had processed every memory of that day into pure principle, and you are now ready to die or have bliss because you can compress well.
Okay, very good. All right, and speaking about shareable waves and compression and the cascade, speak about tinfoil hats. What are tinfoil hats, and how do they function in that context?
Well, let's talk to the woo-woos, shall we?
No, but does a tinfoil hat actually have a function? A little cone tinfoil hat.
Well, actually, when I think it was Ingo Swann was heating that thermistor with his mind at a distance. So they thought it would be cool they could prove that he could light a fire with his mind at a distance through a Faraday cage. Well, that Faraday cage served the function of the tinfoil hat, which is to say, and they had the idea, see, if they proved that the electric signal got from your brain to lighting a flame with your mind at a distance. But what they didn't understand is the nature of the longitudinal array, which will go through just about anything. So there's two important lessons here. One is actually the tinfoil hat or the Faraday cage is the opposite of what you need for immortality. What you need for immortality is embeddability. Isolation of charge is the opposite, actually. And so the nature of surviving into the array is to find the places of the array where the charge distribution is most compressed. Luke Skywalker going deep underground to learn how to raise his Jed. He didn't use a tinfoil hat. Hell no. He used deep into nature.
Oh, yeah. Love that. Love that. Okay, good. So speak about the fractality of pure truth and right action, which is my credo. I only asked this because yesterday I was speaking to some of the military intelligence folk that I'm sequestered here with, as I said, behind razor wire and electric fences here in Southern Africa. And I was speaking to them about my own methodology of walking boldly in life and just broadcasting from the center, because a theme in my life for over 20 years has been, you've got to keep it down. You've got to keep invisible. You've got to keep, watch your back. You've got to, take precaution. I've disagreed consistently with that. It's got me into trouble on occasion and in some serious life-threatening situations on occasion. But here I am, for instance. Now, I know, Dan, and you've been part of the help on my journey as a mentor in a sense. unbid mentor, that pure truth, if you hold that and you beam it and you are bold enough to overcome those psychic knots, which we all have, and those, the fear complex and all of that shit show, just walk out of your front door and speak your mind. That seems to ultimately create its own protections. I'm certain that pure truth, the flame of pure truth, as I would have it, is the highest protection that we can conjure. Is there a hyperdimensional fractality going on, or am I just a belligerent?
Well, that speaks to a lovely metaphor, which is, we've always said that if you had enough implosion of bliss, access to bliss in your heart, in your body, that will toast not only your body parasites, but your astral parasites. So yes, if the implosion is great enough, then it's going to do the sorting. That is a fundamental principle, and very wise and very true. So if someone is really walking around with pure enough intention, that will burn the dross in their aura. Actually, but what occurred to me at the beginning of what you said was, if we take what I consider the greatest lie in the history of this planet, was when the US government lied that they lost to the Nazis and made a treaty with the wrong Greys and Dracos, and millions of humans got abducted by those same Greys and Dracos. And the USA now cannot admit that the ETs are here, because immediately they will find out the biggest lie in history has just been conducted by the US government, and whose neck is on the line? Oh my God. So does truth about that? Well, you see, that's why at a deep level, when a whole government is based on a giant schizophrenic lie, what does there have to be some form of charge collapse?
Very good, very good. And of course, it is all coming out. I mean, the whole JFK exercise, and CIA's complicity, with Bobby Kennedy now running for office, that's been completely exposed. But it's everywhere you look.
And Michael Salla did a pretty good job of linking JFK's death directly to that lie. And many other people have worked on that. They've done a good job. So suddenly the whole US, everything the US government stands for is based on the biggest lie in history, practically. Trillions and trillions of dollars spent lying to the constituents, because they believe that their humans would be too stupid to be informed correctly about the ETs are here. Hello. And so now they've got to maintain the lie, or the government is toast. It's rather
right.
like
I keep reminding Middle America that the US and the hegemony through military might and the US coin, the US dollar, over the last, let's say, half a century or 75 odd years, but certainly subsequent to the end of the Second World War with the new economy. The hegemony of Washington, D.C. has always been the utility of the crown of England, effectively, but the crowns of Europe, you could say, the black nobility, the Vatican complex. So that blowback that's hitting America now, and exposing the CIA and all the rest of it, is bound to then kick back to Oxbridge and to the Crown of England and to Whitehall and to, Switzerland and the black nobility's enclaves, and of course the Vatican. And then behind the Roman Catholic Vatican is, of course, the black Jesuitical Sabbatean Vatican. So where does it end, Dan? Where does it actually bring us to? The foot of some 13-foot imperial Draco called Pindar?
Pindar was the boss for a while, I think. But, and by the way, you're talking to a guy who graduated from Jesuit University of Detroit. So I'm going to step.
That explains so much, Dan.
No, mentioning Draco is right. So Elena, I think, did get that right. They were the best liars in the galaxy, the Greys and the Draco, who she calls the Nebu. And so it's, Eisenhower and crew are to be forgiven for being tricked. They were. But at a deeper level, when she explained that Anu, Enlil Yahweh's father, was tricked into marrying the Draco, who became the mother of Enlil Yahweh, who brought the Draco into this solar system catastrophically for thousands of years. Amun versus Atun, it's the same story. So, and you know how they tempted him? They said, "Oh, we're going to give you the biggest Stargate in this galaxy, the trapezium in Orion." And so Anu says, "Oh, we're getting the Stargate. It's like they gave me the biggest railroad station. I'm going to take the bait." And that's how it all started. And
Is that right?
Oh yeah, yeah. Elena Denon, I think, did a better job than anybody working out that history. I respect her for that. Absolutely, yeah. And so essentially, yes, we got more Draco blood here. Uru Asa Elem. I said Uru meant Draco. Elena said Uru meant Stargate, and we're both right. But Uru Asa Elem is the place where the Uru Draco makes the Asa Queen take the L or phase shift into longitudinal, called Stargate. And so everybody's fighting over the Stargate, and it was the Orion Stargate. That was the original Orion Wars. So once we recognize the physics of Stargates, which are the same as the physics of the places you can die well and have bliss well, suddenly the transcendence is available, and we don't need a war over a Stargate that's broken. Jerusalem.
Okay. So, right. Uru Usa Elam, how did you put
it? Uru Asa Elem, Jerusalem. Uru, ancient dragon blood was my word. Elena says Uru means Stargate. Well, both, you know. Asa is queen of. El is the place of the phase shift, Elohim. And those who can make a phase shift in their blood to longitudinal coherence literally have a soul, physicsofsoul.com. That's what this war over the Stargate was. And that's exactly what the Draco lost, physics of soul.
Physics of soul, pure and simple.
That's the only thing Humpty Dumpty's egg was about. You know, for how many thousand years the Draco massaged the royal families of Europe just like they were show dogs, because Humpty Dumpty's egg could not be put together. I mean, they couldn't make a soul, which means they lost long-term memory, coherent lucid dreaming, no. And it means the Draco named Charlie, who ran Montauk, had to abduct human teenagers to steer the time chair because he didn't have a soul.
Oh, God. Okay. And where does this thing come into the equation here, Dan?
Double Georgie. Actually, there was a crystal in the center, and if you squeezed it correctly, it would emit a implosive piezoelectric spark, which would ignite the plasma beam out the ends. Enki described it very well. Elena uses and had it there, and I explained the physics quite well. But it's up the center axis is a piezo quartz implosive crystal, and it's a phase conjugate pump wave that causes that literally to create warp factor. And we even know how to make Luke Skywalker's plasma beam now.
Well, you're talking about the Vogel crystal, the 5260-degree angle. Yeah, very exciting stuff indeed.
Yeah, and Vogel approximated phase conjugation by making the sides curved. I mean, the sides not parallel, but actually the ancient Atlantean fire crystal and the true Koski frost crystal, the sides are parallel, and it's a precise.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, it's
but the angle is still 5260.
The peak angle is related to 52 and 76, which is a phase conjugate angle. That's correct. But the sides are parallel. They're not. See, Vogel knew that he needed a longitudinal wave out the end. He was there sweating with his crystal, trying to influence the plant polygraph with Cleve Baxter in Toronto. I was there. And so the phase conjugate pump wave in that case was his body. Sacrocranial pump harmonics are the phase conjugate pump wave that made that crystal work. However, the accurate phase conjugate pump wave used in Atlantis and Fire Crystal actually is PlanckFire.com. That's the accurate. And in that case, the stability is much greater if the sides are parallel, really. And that will be at firecrystal.com. PHI.
Very interesting indeed. Very interesting indeed. Thank you. Wow. Okay. Dan, what you mentioned Jerusalem. I wasn't going to go there, but I think this is really interesting because we're talking about, shift of ages. We're talking about morphogenetic upshift and all these extraordinary elements that are now composing the orchestra of our reality, so to speak, or our collapsing reality. What significance in real terms does we understand the geopolitical relevancy of Israel and of the fact that is the ground zero of the Washington complex and its bullshit agenda, backed up by the Crown, backed up by the Vatican. But what's really going on in Gaza at the moment?
Well, the research tends to indicate that Enlil caused circumcision, for example, as a profoundly plasma parasitic nightmare, actually. And this pervades through the religious tradition that, Yahweh was a Draco. Let's be very clear. And that was a culture where miracle worship was the only coin, and where at the top you had what I think Anne Rice correctly described as the largest plasma parasite in the solar system. She named it Enkil, who is literally the Grim Reaper who you see at the time of death, which is Enlil, actually. And so, whether Netanyahu has to keep the war going because as soon as it ends, he's out of office and then he goes to jail and he knows that. Well, that's only a little superficial local issue. The bigger issue is that the humans must recognize that their gate to ensoulment is essentially the opposite of what those religions have been teaching them. That miracle worship and personality worship are the opposite to the path of ensoulment. They're disempowering, childish, and they cause religion wars. So until I say that the physics of soul.com can be taught to scientists and government, completely replacing the disempowering miracle worship and personality worship of both Roman Catholic and Jewish religions with pure, self-empowering, gorgeously beautiful, pure scientific principle, that's our way out of these conflicts, I believe. That's been my mission. And actually, goldenmean.info/Jesus physics.
So Dan, to place one's attention on, I've been coming under some fire from my political activist work, because I refused point blank to make any mention of this Israel Palestine shit show since it began. And it is what it is. It's an Armageddon. It's a Holocaust. It's beyond repulsive and evil. But my deep sense on the eve of that conflation was that this, or conflagration, my deepest impulse said to me, do not place attention toward it or upon it, and do not speak to it. And I couldn't do it, and I have not been able to. What am I lacking?
Well, I think you were a bit of a genius when you asked the right question earlier. What is forgiveness for the biggest sin? It's okay. We've got 10 or 20 generations of hatred between the Jews and the Arabs there, but we have thousands of years of hatred between Enlil and Enki, Amun and Atun going on there. So where is the possibility of forgiveness? And I think if we look deep inside this, we see the only way in which children get access to have a soul, exactly what the Draco and Lil and his ancestors, the Siakar, never had access to a soul. So as soon as we understand what process enables young people not just to get an immune system, but to get the kind of bliss that makes a soul. Let's review just a moment. So we now know that when you get, for example, you're on a sacred site and you have a sacred dance or a bliss process and your hair stands up and lightning goes up your tailbone, that implosion, squeeze implodes recursively, braid implodes your DNA, and we've measured the phonons that do that, and braid implodes the glands and the brain waves in the heart, and it all compression implosion, and out the center of the perfect squeeze comes coherent longitudinal stuff, the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body, the only thing that makes you immortal, the only thing that you take through death, and the only thing that enables you to lucid dream, that longitudinal coherence. Suddenly, now we know exactly who an Elohim was, a wannabe who could make the L, actually. So when that process becomes teachable as pure principle, these religion wars fall away like childish stupidity. And forgiveness is seeing the big picture, that actually Thoth, for whom all the royal families were named, and the only definition of the line of David, Tehute, is Thoth, actually, who is Tahuti, who was Hermes, who was Quetzalcoatl, who was the same guy, Veracocha, same guy. His only agenda, even when he was babysitting all the Aboriginals of South America, his only agenda was to teach the humans how to have a soul, called Adam Kadmon in that case, which is actually learning the science of how you access the implosive compression of bliss and radiate an aura that literally makes you immortal. You become a sun god, you go through the sun, do all the fun stuff. And that so well replaces the childish religion wars, I call that forgiveness.
Very good. Very good. Was Akhenaten an important historical icon in this context?
It's a perfect turning point. Well, if you read Out of Egypt, House of the Messiah, where Akhenaten, he couldn't balance a checkbook for his life, Atun Enki. So he had just disenfranchised all the bankers. I mean, the Amun priests of Egypt, who were all pissed as hell at him. So he changed his name to Moses, ran for his life, took the Ark of the Covenant, and became a gold powder cook called the righteous priest, the origins of the royal Essenes, literally the family of Jesus and Mary. So absolutely Akhenaten is a turning point, and it's really quite simple. The Syrians and the advanced CTs, they planned for the bloodline of what became Tutankhamun, later the same as Jesus. They planned that for hundreds of years, like Muad'Dib and Dune. And the problem was they tried to get the Avatar bloodline into Egypt's royal line, Thoth Moses, which is why Thoth told Bueller, the best Templar on the planet, that he was the father of Magdalene and Jesus. And he's right, by the way. So they couldn't get the Avatar bloodline into Jesus because of the damn bankers. I mean, Amun priests. I mean, Enlil. So the theater of that development passed to the Essenes. And that was the turning point. Absolutely. House of the Messiah, Out of Egypt, Ahmed Usman, and even then Lawrence Gardner agreed. You know, Akhenaten actually literally was Moses. And that then you know where the royal line of the Essenes came from. And that's where Jesus and Magna, and that's called the Grail bloodline, by the way. And the Grail bloodline is literally charge implosion.
What was the connection between the Essenes and the Cathars?
Well, the Cathar were imitating the Essenes in many ways. Ex-Cathari, Kata. The Ka is literally a name for the Ba from the Ka out of Egypt. Gives you a little clue. And their prefix were literally, the science of bliss was their religion. And that was very useful. Absolutely. And we live in Cathar country, so we should know.
Very good. Very good. This is a slide from my current lecture. I'm just about to kick off a tour in the United Kingdom in a couple of days' time. Cain and Abel, Enki, Enlil, Tatars, Khazars. Is that a fair deduction?
Yeah, Lawrence Gardner says that Cain for Cain is the origin of the word for king, actually. And Cain and Abel, when dissected, is the Enlil Enki controversy. As far as the Khazarians, you've studied that more than me. You know, I was a little bit aware of how the Ashkenaz were differentiated from the original Sephardic Jews. That I did a lot of study on that, actually. And in every case, each race is basically trying to say, our bloodline has access to the fractal seed of implosion. And that's the essential claim. And the Khazars, the Ashkenaz, they didn't have that. That actually clearly was not there. But actually, if you take the word Khazar, Ka is obviously the coherence of the body of light. And the R was ancient Sumerian, which we now know is the ancient Anak language, is what Sumerian is, the Anunnaki. And R means a vehicle of light, as an Argonaut. So Khazar tells you they were aiming for.
Extraordinary. This here, for me, just an image of Tsar Nikolai and the Wall Street trio, Trotsky, Lenin, and what's his face, Marx. Of course, the culling of the noble family of Tsar Nikolai, the Romanovs. The connection between the Romanovs and, again, the collapsing of the Bolshevik Revolution financed by Wall Street, which is to say the British Crown and the Vatican, the takedown of the Romanov dynasty, now the resurrection of the hallowed bloodlines of that part of the world through the resurgence by Putin, the connection between Nikola Tesla and the Romanov bloodlines, and Trump's uncle I think his name was John here.
Yeah.
It's all interesting stuff that I've been looking at. Very, very interesting stuff. And what seems to make Vladimir Putin impenetrable and unstoppable, indefatigable, or whatever that word is. What's going on there? Do you think that there is a resurrection possibly of that? If it's Enki and Lil, Tatar versus Khazar, for sure, the last 13,000 year galactic sleep cycle has been Khazarian kind of inertia behind that has been, death and entropy and centrifugal, this, that, and the other. Do you think that the resurrection of the angelic template, so to speak, that's to use my language, is connected to what we're seeing geopolitically with this unstoppable energy coming through Vladimir Putin? And I believe he's guiding a resurrection of the Tatarian in a sense.
Yeah.
Does that make any kind of sense to you?
Well, the pattern here, I think, was articulated quite well by Lawrence Gardner when he called it the dispossession, when the king and the pope basically conspired to be sure that every aspect of the ancient Grail Thoth bloodline was murdered out of the royal families of Europe. They called it the dispossession. And the dispossession, dispossessed, literally meant the bloodline of Jesus was removed from every royal family of Europe through that conspiracy at that time. For example, Catherine of Russia related closely to Elizabeth of England, related closely to the royal family. So the original royal families of Europe were the Thoth bloodline. Actually, there was the possibility of actual bliss in those bloodlines, and removing those bloodlines from power, which is to remove the Grail from power, which is to remove Thoth, which fits the Catherine of Russia, then becomes, the current Russian experiment. So clearly there was a movement to remove from government any family line that had access to real bliss process. That's a recurrent pattern here, because any family that has consistent access to bliss process is going to be lucid dreamers, they're going to be psychokinetic, and they're going to be powerful. And the bad guys, the Dracos and the Greys, cannot handle that. No.
Very interesting. Very good.
So
Speaking of fringe Illuminati, is there anything worthy in this exercise, the great mission to Mars? What do you make of this?
Well, Elena, I think, is probably correct when he says that Elon Musk was at the Jupiter Accords on Jupiter, and our friends who claim to know him well said that Elon Musk is quite aware of electrogravitics. We tried to teach him, but said the government has his hands completely tied, actually, which is part of the whole, revelation, conspiracy, disclosure. So actually, I think Elon Musk has to be aware that his present rockets look pretty stupid when you know anything about electrogravitics, not to mention electric cars driven by, a mineral that's just absolutely poisoning the planet. No, this is bad news. So,
right. It's bad science, right? It's all bad science.
It's just so obsolete as to be nauseatingly disgusting. You take a molten nickel thermal battery called Red Sun, go redstaregg.com on one of our energy projects. A molten nickel battery the size of a suitcase, and you can run a dump truck for a month on the power in that thermal battery. I mean, and there's 100 better ways to do that, like implosive hydrogen hydrolysis. There's 1,000 ways to do this more elegantly. Yeah. So the fact that we're stuck in such dinosaurs farting technology is pretty bad sign, actually.
Okay, so let me refine the question. Is there anything redeemable about the science and the vision promulgated by Elon Musk in your view?
Well, I think he is an example of total recall. There he is, fixated on the Martian memory. And the Martian memory, lost the atmosphere, was run by Dracos at the time. It was a nightmare. That place is not the dream planet. Even when the Nazis had their dark fleet just after Hitler disappeared, and they tried to get a corner of real estate on Mars. They had to sacrifice thousands of humans for human slave trades just to buy a little patchwork on Mars before the Federation kicked all the Dracos out of Mars. So hell no, his trip to Mars is not the right dream right now. Hell no.
Very good. Did we get to the moon in your view? Simply.
Oh, yes, I think, there were some lies in the early phases, but, enough astronauts. The thing about the moon is I think those pictures of the Greys and the Dracos parked all around the crater where the first human moonwalkers go. You've seen those pictures. Those are real. The moon was absolutely crowded with the bad guys at the time when the humans landed there. So hell no, they didn't land alone. That's a scream. But the Federation did a good job of kicking the bad guys out of the moon, I think. And I think Elena got that right. Remember, the moon was the Death Star in that it was hollow and metal, and you have to avoid it if you want a seed to germinate because the longitudinal doesn't get through, which is why eclipses are nightmares for astral hygiene. But the moon's core is run by an intelligent plasma being, which is actually a very advanced. So the moon, although, Alex Collier said we should tow it out of here, he was actually wrong. The orbit would just absolutely disintegrate. So it was actually elegantly put there and served a function and is evolving today. And they're building there the medbeds.
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's the main technology on the moon right now is medbeds, I think.
That's fascinating. It's not the med beds that I'm here currently, as I said, witnessing here. Nothing to do with the moon. But that's very, very interesting indeed. So the moon is spheroid or spherical?
Yeah, it's an ancient hollowed out planetoid, mostly titanium metal, and rang like a bell for days when NASA hit it with a hammer. And this was the Andromedans' favorite thing to do. They grabbed it in a hurry after the Lesser Dryad when they blew up Tiamat and the rain came down, and it was called the Lesser Dryad. It was the biggest flood on the planet practically, and so they had to restabilize the solar system in a hurry. So they towed that thing here in an emergency, and the moon was definitely not there before 10 to 12.
And we know it for a number of reasons. The pock marks on the moon are only on the facing side, principally, meaning to say it was towed. The pock marks, I think, only extend 2 kilometers in depth uniformly. Doesn't matter how big the impact was. It only hit something impenetrable at 2 kilometers. Helium-3, what's that all about? Does that? Why helium-3?
Well, that was the energy curriculum of one of the Andromedan fleets, I'm sure. The point was the orbit alone of the moon is proof of intentional intelligence, actually. It was the best way. And, we wouldn't have our orbit today without the moon. We desperately needed that. The solar system was literally falling apart at the time. And what happened was Enlil's team had tried to bomb the hell out of Enki's Atlantis team at the time, and Enki lost badly. And the Federation sent him in here to try to rescue and got the moon in here. But, Enki had to skip town for a couple thousand years.
Now when was that, Dan? Because my understanding is that there's no record, petroglyph or hieroglyph or otherwise, of the moon anywhere beyond, I think, 6,000 years or something. I mean,
I thought around the 10. I thought 10 to 12,000 was my impression. But
you may be right. But it's
around
very.
Lesser Dryad, Great Flood time. Yes, there's no record of a moon before then. So yeah, they basically, the Federation had made a complete mess of the solar system at that point by trying to bomb the hell out of the Nebu here, and both sides lost, and the solar system was falling apart fast. The water from Tiamat was the Great Flood of the Dryads, actually. And Elena and lots of people have figured, even Hancock figured that out. Hancock got it all right, except he doesn't know who done it. He always says there's this mysterious guy behind the scenes. Well, I'll tell you who that was. In every case, Hancock, it was Thoth, Tahuti, Quetzalcoatl. Same guy. That's the guy that did everything you're talking about, Mr. Hancock.
So, and Thoth, just to break it down again for the stupid simple like me, Thoth was Hermes Trismegistus, was Moses, was who else? I mean,
Thoth was Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha and Hermes. Actually, his original name was Ishka when he was dispatched with the Anak Enki and Enlil, because they knew that Enlil was going to be a hell of a problem here. So they sent Ishka, who's an alchemy teacher at the time, later called Thoth, and Tehute, which became DWD, Tehuti, which is where the origin of the term line of David. So Thoth is the bloodline, absolutely, the royal family of Egypt, the royal family of the Grail, and the royal family of the Sea. It is literally directly Thoth. So Moses is in the bloodline, but that doesn't say he was Thoth. But I believe, actually, I think and Elena and Michael Sala and JP are correct that Thoth, about, I don't know, 10 feet tall, is in one of the arcs under Florida now, because the heart of the earth, which is a living, intelligent plasma being that Ea is in love with, Atun, who is the heart of the earth, and that intelligent plasma being literally is the star navigator steering the plasma core heart of the earth, exactly like the highly evolved plasma being steers the heart of the sun and the heart of the guru.
And why a bird's head?
They called him Serpent Birdman, and the Serpent Birdman story is Quetzalcoatl, obviously, but it's also the story of Kundalini, that the serpent, the reptilian brain stem, spits the Sanchidan, the bliss liquid, literally exploding the growth of the high brain, whose wings are the crystallization of the ventricle liquid horny horns. And those are wings, and you see them on Moses and you see them on Lucifer. And that indicates the completion of a Kundalini circuit, which is winged, quite literally. And this was called Return of the Bird Tribes, and I knew Ken Carey quite well, and the metaphor goes on and on.
Now, you were the first person I ever heard learn from about the snake blood, snake DNA versus bird DNA. Does that still stand? Those two are the sort of genesis point of everything that we see biologically?
Well, the reptilian brain stem is the source of the food for the bird brain. That metaphor is powerful and useful. Actually, I think it was Corinna Muller who went to, was it Thailand with the guy who teaches Tantra? Mantak Chia, yeah. And yeah, they drank the snake venom, the poisonous venom of the snake, and had these incredible initiations under the training of that shaman. So there's a long history in the human of the relationship between the serpent blood and the bird blood. And that combination, as it exists inside the human, is biologically powerful. And the only way Kundalini can work is if the serpent brain feeds the bird brain, and then Quetzalcoatl returns. That's those.
So that again speaks to the bliss point of the harmonium between the negative and the positive, the left and the right, the bird and the snake. So the moon coming in becomes which element? I mean, my contention is still that the moon has been masquerading as the divine feminine and is, if anything, a masculine object. The earth, the eternal mother, the earth is the feminine. The sun, Ra, could be attributed as the masculine. So what then? We're a bit schizoid there. What's the moon, sun, and earth? Where's the polarity, duality, iconography there?
Yeah, I think the masculine feminine metaphor kind of breaks down a bit there, particularly when you're talking about the moon, because, you know, a hollow metal planetoid artificially carved out is not exactly the archetype of the female. Hell,
that ain't my mama.
No, the physics is interesting, that when the moon blocks the sun, the elimination of the longitudinal coherence from the sun means a seed cannot germinate, and every magnetic line on the earth collapses, which is why eclipses are dangerous, absolutely dangerous. And the key is that the longitudinal coherence of the sun, which is the only thing that feeds every seed to grow, is absolutely blocked by the wrong dielectric, which is the hollow metal moon. So that's not very feminine.
Right. So then this idea, Alex Collier, you mentioned, said that, you know, the moon should be steered out. My contention has been for some years that the moon will ultimately, once we've reached harmonium and possibly moved into fifth density, I don't know, the moon no longer serves a function. In that sense, it may well steer itself away.
Well, the The elegance of the orbit of the moon now sure serves a tapestry which enables planets to experience gravity relations erotically, as Gurdjieff said, explaining in part why golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all orbital mechanics. Proof I am right of the cause of gravity, plankfire.com. So the dance of orbits, the moon is serving rather gorgeously right now. And I think, Alex, at that time, the Andromedans were intensely aware of the parasites who had flooded the moon. The Greys and Dracos were running the joint, and the Andromedans were pissed, obviously. But now that the Greys and the Dracos have been ejected from the moon and there's useful stuff going there, his criticism, I don't think, applies anymore, actually.
Okay, interesting. Ormus, handbags. What the devil's going on here?
Yeah, there's a split of opinion. The handbag, if you believe Sitchin, and I believe a few of the things he writes, he says the ME, which was the Sumerian term for computer disk, ME, me asa ur measurement, means you took the computer disk me asa queen of ur Draco and made a measurement with a computer disk. And what's in that bag? Now, the contravening opinion has been, yes, that's where they kept their gold powder. Either way, it's confirming pieces of the Draco culture. What we know is that at that time, the Draco were somewhat dependent on their gold powder addiction, not just for atmosphere maintenance, but for their form of immortality. But later in the Draco culture, not so. Later in the Draco culture, it was a black goo, actually, which is worse, much worse.
Black goo.
Yeah, that episode of it's Dr.
Is this the Harold Couts Vela illusion?
Yes, that's right. The episode of Doctor Who where these black cubes, billions of them, dissolve all the spacecraft. Well, the black goo was a carbon nanomaterial which was phase conjugate and used by an incredibly parasitic interstellar culture, very dangerous. And the lower Draco families, not the Siakar, were horribly infested. And many of our interviewees on secret space programs have talked about the black goo, but they were using this as a communications media to feed a hive mind, a hugely parasitic intelligence. And this was a very, very dangerous carbon nano communicator. So phase conjugate materials, as in Alice and barium titanate lands, phase conjugate material like Elena's communicator in her ear can be incredibly powerful interstellar communicators for the good guys or the bad guys. And phase conjugate materials, because they're the place where the charge implosion can meet. And therefore, that is the ultimate communicator. It's super dielectrics, basically. And so, yeah, carbon nanomaterials, are ultimately the power of the good guys and the bad guys. And it's very important to understand how phase conjugate mirrors work, because it's how you communicate with the ancestors, the Olmec and the Aztec and the obsidian mirrors, that whole story of making phone calls to the ancestors. These were all phase conjugate mirrors. And carbon powder, this black goo, is an example of a super dielectric used horribly by the bad guys and also used by the good guys.
Very interesting. And the connection between that and, for instance, the proliferation now of obviously graphene oxide being pumped into everything that any surgical needle can find its way into, the proliferation of all of these synthetic molecules, the glyphosates, the fluorides, and so on and so forth. But the 5G superstructure catalyzing black mold in the ethers, which I am told on very good authority is a real existential threat. The catalyzing of black mold everywhere at the kind of nano level. What do you make of that? Does that sound pretty in keeping with the Draco logic?
Well, actually, in that case, it's the logic of the Greys and the Draco just tripped over the black goo, and they used the infestation for their lower colonies, but never allowed the royalty. But the physics, which is most instructive, is to study which of the materials have the highest dielectric. Even the original Spanish study that said there were carbon nano in the poison needle, actually, they just said it was a carbon nano emulet. They didn't say And the carbon emulet is still the point, because these are super dielectrics, and super dielectrics are the place where phase conjugate radio can implode and initiate the communication. So study the dielectric constant of, and you will learn which materials are dangerous, actually, and which ones have to be used responsibly. And it's true that our environment, because it's phase conjugation that originated life, and long wave phase conjugation is intelligent life, and shortwave out of context phase conjugation is the ultimate parasite.
Oh, excellent. Dan, closing thoughts. Terrence Howard and his the kind of noise around him lately. What is your takeaway on this man?
Yeah, we just did a short documentary. I think we had 10,000 views in a few days, reviewing Terrence Howard's interview with Joe Rogan. We acknowledged some wonderful genius there, in that, he's looking at the nesting of soap bubbles beautifully. And he's looking how the caduceus wave shape of the nesting of a series of sine waves that looks like a caduceus reforms the atomic table. So he had some wonderful little intuitive insights. But what he's yearning for is actually learning how perfected platonic nesting of soap bubbles creates conjugate implosion. And that is a model of the geometry of the atomic table. Absolutely. But the point is that you can't talk about, well, I just nested an octahedron of spheres, which is his pretty pictures, until you can see where the superset of that nest, which is dodecacosa, creates the platonic symmetry of the electron shells perfectly, platonic symmetry of the nuclear hadrons perfectly. It is literally a platonic nest. It's literally and exactly precisely this nest, which is exactly SPDF electron suborbitals and nuclear hadrons of the nucleus. It's the same exact nest because, and this is what he missed, unfortunately, that nest creates the golden ratio, which makes conjugate implosion, which is the cause of gravity and all life force and consciousness itself. So what he had some intuitions that he's getting close to charge collapse, and that's beautiful. But did he make the physics? He doesn't quite.
So what do you give Terrence Howard on his science revisionism scorecard? 6, 7 out of 10?
His this bit about redoing the arithmetic was terrible.
I thought so too. I'm so glad you said that, Dan.
And even his thing about redoing the atomic table. We know the atomic table is simply a nest of platonic solids. That's electrons and nuclei. Right. And that's old news too. But does anybody know that that's because platonic solid nest makes conjugate implosive charge collapse, which causes the gravity that holds the atom together? He wasn't even close.
Right. Very good. Very good. Dan, there's been absolute delight. And I know that this is going to be the first of a little series that I'm going to absolutely lean in on you for, because what I want to do is get mundane questions from the Lazarus audience to ask you through me, and maybe another conversation. Because I think these questions, like, is the earth round, or did we go to the moon? Or, is snake blood, and, these are really reductive questions, but they're, I think, becoming very, very important as we reassess who we are, what we are, and why we are. Dan, just so lovely to see you, and I thank you so very much for joining us on Lazarus today.
It's great. Yours and my job is both very simple. We need to share and empower, especially our young people, to understand profoundly how when they get access to bliss, they get a soul, and their questions are important. So I'm at your service. Absolutely. Happy to share.
Thank you, Dan. God bless you, brother. All right, friends. Well, you heard it here. I'm going to be leaning very, very hard into Dan Winter in the days ahead. And I know the Lazarus audience are going to lap this one up. And this is, of course, by popular demand in any event. Thanks, friends, for joining us. Bye.